Lesson 4 is going to be based on more complex sonorities, but still based on thirds. Later lessons we'll talk about other kinds of harmony, that is to say not based on thirds. But this will be a rather elaborate and interesting lesson about the things we still can do with thirds. Just before I get into the details, one little preliminary remark. If you look at example 1, you will see an 11th chord. The point is that the more notes you have in a chord, the less the inversions don't necessarily sound like chords in thirds. For example, here's the root position, 11th chord. Now let's look at the inversions. Well, as you can see, in some of these spacings, we have clusters. For example, the last one, D, E, F on the bottom. Okay. In the second one, we have F and G in the middle a second. So some of these spacings get to the point where you almost wouldn't even know it's a 9th or an 11th chord. So it's important to remember that in these cases, it's really the context that's going to determine how it's heard. For example, I could get that last chord in example 1. I could arrive at that in a bunch of different ways. I could arrive at that from a C major chord as a neighbor chord. I could also arrive at it just as an appoggiatura, then going somewhere else. So it's really the context that will determine it. The reason I mention that is when we're talking here about chords built up in thirds, to some extent we're expecting the spacing at least to support that idea. Once you get up to the point where you have all the notes in the scale in the chord, that is to say like a 13th chord, in principle I could arrange them as a cluster. Does that really sound like a 13th chord? So that's something that we need to be clear about. So for now we're still talking about dispositions where the thirds are at least reasonably audible. Okay, let's talk first about 7th and 9th chords. In the classical context, these were just passing dissonances that sort of got frozen into harmony. For example, 7th there, and that became quite common as a chord on its own, the 7th and so on. The 9th, same thing, neighbor note or passing note, okay, and only later came to be used on its own at times. Okay, so as far as that goes, that's nothing very new to the 20th century. What's new to the 20th century are just certain approaches to using these chords. We'll give you a few examples now. Let's look at example 2. So the first thing we could notice, or the first possibility, would be irregular resolutions for these chords. For example, if I take a plain 9th chord, normally I would expect the resolution to be onto the simple triad. Let's look at example 2B1. So what happens here? We have the 9th on top with a neighbor note. Normally that would go to C, but here the C is in the middle voice. So that gives you a rather more tense kind of sonority. So that would be one rather irregular resolution. Another irregular resolution is 2B2. This, instead of resolving onto a simple consonance, the resolution chord is also dissonant. So it's one dissonance resolving into another dissonant chord. If we look at example 2B3, is an example of a different kind of arrangement. Here the 9th chord just resolves onto a chromatically surprising chord. So although the C goes down, instead of going to C, it's going to C sharp. Now 2B4. Here the dissonance resolves with a leap and in addition onto a dissonant chord. Again, okay, so another new way of using these harmonies is the way they're used in jazz. In other words, 9th chords are used as sort of normal sonorities, which don't need to resolve at all. Okay, very, very common situation in jazz harmony, especially when you see parallel chords, which we'll talk about a little later. Okay, so here are a couple of examples. Example 3A. If you look at example 3A, we see that the main chord is a ninth chord. First inversion underneath, but it's a ninth chord. After that, we have a neighbor chord. Okay, this chord over here is also a ninth chord. Okay, go back to the first chord, but the first chord hasn't really resolved. It just sort of leaned on the neighbor chord and came back. Then after that, it goes down, another ninth chord. And the last chord sounds rather different from the rest. Why does the last chord sound different? Well, it's a ninth chord also, but if you look at the spacing, the dissonance is closer. The dissonance here, the strong dissonance, is the one between the C in the left hand and the B in the right hand. In the first chord, the dissonance was between the C and the D, so it's farther apart. It's a major second, not a minor second. In the last chord, it's between C and B natural, which is like a minor second. So that means that that last chord, because of the spacing and the minor second, gives a stronger dissonance. Let's listen to that again. Other possibilities are to treat the tonic ninth chord as stable. There's a very famous example of that in Ravel's Jeu d'eau. That's a tonic ninth chord, and it's just treated as a tonic stable chord. Another way to use the ninth chords could be what we see in example 3B. In 3B, what I'm doing is I'm using the last inversion of the ninth chord as a kind of an accent chord. Let's listen to 3B. In 3B, the beginning, this is a ninth chord A. Next chord is a ninth chord on C, both inverted, but we're still with thirds quite prominent in the spacing. Then we go to a ninth chord, just a major chord with a major ninth, but after the spacing in that last chord, so that the chord is actually C, E, G, B flat, D flat, but if I put the D flat and the B flat on the bottom, it's quite dissonant. We notice the low D flat against the C on the top. The result is it's a very strong, almost percussive chord, and for a situation like this when we need an accent, it's appropriate. Let's listen to that one again. Okay, when you're using these kind of chords regularly, like all the time, we have to talk about the issue of how do we get a cadence. Well, we need to lessen the tension for a cadence. So there's different aspects of the music we have to pay attention to. Okay, in principle, how do we lessen tension? Well, one simple thing is the rhythm. For example, if we look at example 4, if you look at example 4, just the fact that the first three chords of those chords, the only one that arrives on the strong beat with a long duration is the last one. So it tends to sound like a cadence. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of example 4 is the bass line. So that's sort of like a classical 1-6, 4, 5, 1. So the fifth leap in the bass also helps to create a sense of cadence over here. So that's a voice leading issue, and it's just as true here as it is in classical harmony, even though the harmonies we're using are rather more complicated. It's also possible to reduce to a triad of the cadence, or a triad with an added note. In example 4, the second ending, what I've done is if I had done it without the added note, it would be which sounds very final indeed. If I wanted a cadence that isn't quite so strong, I could use the added note to make it not quite as final as all that. Okay. Another interesting possibility is because these chords are all rather unstable, If I use a spacing with a strong interval on the bottom, like an octave or especially a fifth, that also can sound like a cadence. Let's listen to example 5. In example 5, you'll notice that at the beginning, I have a ninth chord. The ninth is doubled. It even has a double neighbor note around it. Then a neighbor note on the other side. Now watch what happens at the end. The bass now is, the left hand is a fourth, and then notice how's that fifth in the left hand gives a certain solidity, kind of feeling of arrival. That's why it sounds like a cadence. So that's how we look at the question of cadence. The other side of the same issue is how do we look at the question of accent? Again, when everything is dissonant, just one dissonance is not going to create an accent. So, how do we create an accent? Well, we can certainly add another dissonance, like example 6, part 1, or ending number 1. That would do that extra note there creates extra emphasis for the accent. So while it's rhythmically cadential, the harmony isn't cadential at all. The harmony is saying we're still going on. Let's listen to 6, ending 1. Now let's contrast that with 6, ending number 2. The main thing that happens here is the accent is done by a leap. That big leap in the melody gives a sense of sort of emphasizing the chord afterward, plus the A flat in the bass against the G in the right hand also makes it a strong dissonance. Third possibility, example 6, ending number 3. Here what I've done is I've made a cluster. So that the cluster gives it a kind of heaviness at the end. The last way to create an accent would be simply using altered tones. Let's listen to 6, ending 4. So here we've got chromatic notes that are surprising over here. All of these, though, create accents of one sort or another. Now, if we look at all the different kinds of ninth chords, because there are many possibilities, if you look at example 7a, you'll see that what I've done here is I've taken from Persichetti a classification of the ninth chords, which we might qualify as being from the flattest to the sharpest. For example, the first chord, diminished triad, diminished seventh, minor ninth. And so on. All those chords get gradually more open sounding. In other words, we're progressing gradually toward larger intervals. This progression gives us an interesting way to create a sense of changing harmonic color from the quite dull colors at the beginning to a much brighter color at the end. Here's a very little composition to show you how that works. Let's listen to example 7b. As we've seen in example 7b, it starts off with the most flat version of the ninth chords and gradually goes up to the sharper versions. As a result, that makes the sound brighter and brighter. So we start from this, then at the forte we're quite a difference in color. Then for the ending, we go back to the ending, to the beginning, with a somewhat more bright ending. We've sort of gone from the beginning of the series to the middle of the series. So this is a way, just by using that gradation, we can create a phrase with building harmonic tension or a sense of light coming out in the harmony.